There we are. Tim, if you want to go ahead.
Okay, thank you, David. I want to just mention it's an honor to come to you tonight and on behalf of the Deacon Council to present the summary of our findings and looking at the conversations we had earlier this year regarding human sexuality. So I'm going to start my my slides up here. Give me a second. There we go. Okay, you should be able to see the slides on your screen right now. Just to kind of go over at a very high level, our objective for tonight is, so as I mentioned, we're going to present the summary of the responses that we collected during the conversations earlier this year. So I'll be presenting the findings and kind of a little background on how we got to this point. And then at the end of the presentation, we're going to present, David's actually going to present some next steps that the Deacon Council came up with in terms of where do we go from here. So, and just some little housekeeping, we're going to keep everyone muted just to ensure there's no background interference. And we recommend that you may want to have a pad of paper and a pencil at your side there. So if going through the slides, if you have any questions, to write them down, because we will have a question and answer session at the end. And Tammy Cressy Lowry has agreed to kind of facilitate that for David and I to answer questions as they come up. So if you want to get some paper and pencil while they finish this, to be prepared to jot down some questions as we go, that might be a good idea. And then I think that's it. We're going to get started. So again, welcome, and I'm glad you're here, and let's get started. So I'm putting the mission statement up here as just kind of to help us frame this conversation. It was part of our conversations during the earlier this year when we met, and it's part of kind of how we want to frame our thinking in terms of how we're going to address the topic of LGBTQ+. So why are we doing this? I want to quickly go over with you kind of some a high-level timeline on kind of what brought us to this point. And I was kind of surprised when I put this together. I had heard from different people at church that Greg Hunt was the one that they remembered kind of started having conversations with the Deacon Council about LGBTQ+ as a community. And I also found out that Keith Herron did the same. John Lepper, when he was intentional interim, took the Deacon Council through this. And then, of course, David just finished that in 2019 with us. And then we, in turn, had the opportunity to talk with the congregation earlier this year. So there's a long history here of this church wanting to ensure that we understand how we interact with the LGBTQ+ community members and future members, and how we can better enable them to be part of our church. The other thing I'll mention is the Strategic Plan Committee. You remember this document. Out of this committee came the mission statement that I showed you just a couple slides ago, and we're going to look at it one more time. But that is the frame in which the Deacon Council did their work to understand the LGBTQ+ community and how that impacts our understanding of our mission statement, which is part of the Strategic Committee. The church saw that in a draft form and was allowed to add comments and suggestions to change wording. And then Mike Goff and his team came up with the final version that we're currently going to look at in a second. And then you'll also remember David walked us through his strategic plan and kind of helped us understand what his objective was for Holmeswood as the new senior pastor. So one more time, the mission statement. I just want to make sure we're clear. This is what we're managing to. We're trying to, not only the Bible, but also our commitment to provide an atmosphere for people to journey with the inclusive Christ and embrace all with God's transforming love. So let's look at the process. So in 2019, the Deacon Council met under Shirley Hall as the chair, and with David's support and guidance and leadership, they walked us through a journey that took almost a year. And in that journey, we reviewed theological information from different theologians. David provided an exhaustive Bible study of verses pertaining to homosexuality that actually had that word translated from Hebrew or Greek, homosexuality. And then he was also assisted by the pastoral staff who are part of the Deacon Council in terms of our meetings. And so they took the responsibility, the pastoral staff and David took the responsibility of walking us through the material, facilitating our conversation so we could create a safe space by which we could discuss LGBTQ plus ideas and topics. And then out of that conversation came the letter that was sent out to the church announcing the upcoming conversations that we held in January and February of this year. So the next slide that's up here outlines basically for you the different sessions that we held for people to participate. We had 8 sessions with 2 meetings apiece on different dates, different days of the week, and different times, and different locations. 2 of those 2 meeting sessions were held in the fellowship hall. One was held at Kingswood Manor, another was held at Blue Moose. And then we had a final meeting on the 9th of February, which allowed the facilitators and recorders to go through the same set of questions that the congregation went through and provided responses. So this gives you a sense of the meetings we held. And then one final point, on the 9th of February, that opening session was recorded with David's review of the Bible material, Mike Goff's review of the mission statement, and Shirley Hall's introduction. And then we archived that recording for people to review at a later time. If they couldn't attend the conversations, they could look at that recording, could write down their thoughts on the questions and hand those in so we could include their responses in all the data that we looked at in the presentation that we're walking through today. So this slide shows you out of the different places we met, the number of individuals that attended. And since there were 2 sessions for each meeting, we took the highest count of individuals for both sessions. So we didn't double count anyone, we just counted the maximum. So we ended up with 132 individuals from Holmeswood that attended the conversations on the different dates on the previous slide. So the session content. So we had 2 sessions, as I mentioned, for each meeting. The first session was the introduction by Shirley Hall and welcome, David going through the Bible verse material, Mike Goff walking us through the history of the mission statement. And then in the first session, we looked at 2 questions that basically framed and asked us to consider what made us excited about the conversations, as well as what made us anxious about those conversations. And then we met for a second session the following week. The first question in that session was what had been stirring inside of our souls and in our hearts since we'd last met. And then we went through the final 3 questions. The fourth question was an experience question, asking individuals to share their experience with someone who shared with them their gender identity and kind of their journey at embracing that and sharing how they walk through that journey. And then the last 2 questions focused on the mission statement and how did the mission statement impact inclusion of LGBTQ plus individuals, as well as different privileges and things available to members at Holmeswood. How did LGBTQ folks, how should they be able to interact in those privileges or ordinances? So I'm just going to leave this up here for just a quick few seconds for you to look at. These are the 6 questions we looked at as a group that I've already talked about. So I'll let you see these for a couple seconds, then I'll move on. Okay, so what was our methodology? So we wanted to provide an atmosphere for individuals to freely offer their responses to the questions. We did not keep track of who said what. We did not keep track of how often someone responded to the question directly or to someone else's response to the question. We did not require everyone to answer the question. If they were comfortable not answering, or if they just preferred to listen, that was quite all right. One of the things we tried to do was just take people's responses down, and that's what the recorders were tasked with. We did not follow up and ask for clarity unless it was something we couldn't hear, but we just took down the response that people gave us. And then the thing that we did in the fellowship hall, and I know at the other venues, is we gave people an opportunity, someone from each group of 8 people or so, to get up and share what they heard from within their group when they asked the questions and responded, so that we could kind of get some feedback, at the time that we had the meetings. And then we collected the responses, and kind of to give you a sense for how we did that, I mentioned that, we had recorders whose job it was to just copy down whatever anyone said anonymously. We didn't capture who said what. The fellowship hall, we tried to keep the groups about at 8 people large. We tried to do the same thing at the Kingswood engagement or venue, as well as the Blue Moose venue. And then we also gave folks the opportunity to take the questions home in case during the time between meetings they wished to write anything down and send it in either via email, or there was a inbox in the workroom where they could add those, so that at the end of the last session on February 9th or February 26th, 26th, that we would be able to get all the information in together, so that we could collate everything and begin to look at the responses and understand what kind of information we got from that. So this slide talks a little bit about how we actually analyzed the data. As you'll remember, we asked people questions and people responded with a text with multiple sentences or one sentence or maybe a phrase. And so we grouped the answers by question. Each question was assigned a phrase, a single word or a phrase of different words to kind of help capture the intent of that person's response. And then as we read through responses, we assigned the same category to that response if it matched the intent of previous phrases that we used, so that we could begin to understand prevalence and trends within the responses for each question. Once that was done, we developed a word cloud for each question. And then that data package was distributed to the Deacon Council members on the active council, as well as deacons that participated as facilitators or recorders. And then we had a meeting in August to go over the data package and for everyone to provide feedback. And I believe the deacons had the data packet for about 2 weeks or longer because we handed it out in March, but then COVID happened and we canceled that meeting and then delayed looking at this to see if the COVID situation was going to change or if we were going to stay isolated from going to church. And since we did that, then we decided to go ahead and continue forward with finishing out this task. So in August, the Deacon Council met, they looked at the data packet, they provided feedback, answered questions, tried to get the data packet down to how we were going to finalize the responses and then begin to look at those. The other thing I'll mention, as some of you may recall in your meetings when you sat in your groups, some people may have provided a response that included someone's name. And I'll just give you an example. Let's say they said, well, I know this individual and I know they happen to be gay. And we decided that in order to keep everything confidential, that when the Deacon Council received the data package, we redacted anyone's name from a response. So if someone mentioned someone's name in their response, that name was removed, but the rest of the response was left intact. So we did some redaction because we promised confidentiality of the conversations as well as any information that anyone would see. So just so you know, that's what we did. Okay, so now I want to move from kind of the process and how we got there to actually start looking at the information in terms of the responses. So just a little bit about letter distribution and percent attendance. So Terry Brown sent out the letter that we developed in the Deacon Council in 2019 to 187 family units, and that resulted in 268 individuals that actually received a letter. As I mentioned earlier in the slide talking about attendance at the sessions, we had 132 people attend those sessions, which is about half of the people who received a letter. The other thing we wanted to look at was kind of understand what should we anticipate in terms of how many people would we expect to show up for the conversations. And we looked at the attendance sheets prior to COVID or pre-COVID, and we saw that our average attendance was around 150 people. So if you look at that as the denominator, that gave us about 88% of people that attended on a regular Sunday worship service that attended the conversations themselves, is kind of an indicator for people to see what number of people who got the letter, who then attended, about what percentage of people that come in on a Sunday would attend these conversations. This slide shows you the age of attendance of responders in groups of 10. So 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 21 to 30, 31 to 40, et cetera. You'll notice that if you look at the upper end of these from 60 forward, those are approximately considered seniors in our population. So that is around 63% of the responders who attended the conversations were in the senior age category. That's 83 individuals. Then if you look at middle age, which is the next to 40 to 60, thereabouts, we had 25 individuals, or 19% in that age range. And then if you look at the millennial age range, which is anywhere from 20 to up to 40, we had about 21 or 16%. And then we had about 3 individuals, or 2%, that were less than 21 years of age attend the conversations. So this gives you a good sense of kind of the demographics from an age perspective of who attended the conversations in January and February of this year. Okay, so now we want to look at the responses. So when we looked at the responses, the Deacon Council, we decided to kind of group the responses together based on like questions. So we had 6 questions. The first 3 questions really focus on member expectations and any concerns they had about the conversations. And so we looked at all of that, those responses as a group. And then the second, there's 2 other groups of questions. Question 4 is its own group, which talked about individuals who had an experience where someone shared with them their gender identity. And then the last 2 questions deal with the mission statement, as well as how does being an LGBTQ person, member at Holmeswood, allow that person access to different member privileges. And I'll look at those in detail in a second. So this slide here is showing you all of the responses by response category for the first 3 questions. And this is the associated word cloud. You'll notice there are 5 response tags that are in dark blue. And what the word cloud does is allows you to input the universe of responses. And then it takes those responses and puts them into a word cloud. And it groups the responses by the category tag that's applied to them. So it groups all the same responses together as a group. And then it applies a font size to that group to let you see which are the most common or the prevalent responses, down all the way to single responses that have their own tag alone. No one else said a response with that intent. So the top 5 that you see here, actually the top 2 are open conversations and avoid division. And then the next 3 are increased tolerance, the time is now, and no clear response. So these dark blue are the top 5 responses, prevalent responses of these 3 questions in terms of member expectations and concerns. And I'll talk a little bit more about these in terms of summary statements in a second. But I wanted you to see this group because I'm going to use it in another slide that's kind of small to see. So I wanted you to be able to see that clearly. So the summary for these 3 questions in terms of what do the responses tell us as a deacon council. I'm going to read these to you and then I'll give you a second to read them on your own. The responses indicated the time is now to address the extent of membership privileges that apply to LGBTQ+ members, as seen in the Holmeswood mission statement. The responses showed an excitement to have the conversations regarding LGBTQ+ members, as well as the mission statement. The responses also demonstrated an increased tolerance toward fully including LGBTQ+ persons into Holmeswood. The responses to these questions also folks wish to maintain open relationships as an important element of the life at Holmeswood. And then the responses also showed a desire to maintain unity and avoid loss of members and division within the church, but not at the expense of reducing privileges for LGBTQ+ members compared to members in general. So I'll give you a second to look at those summary statements and then I'll go on. And again, we'll have a time for questions later on. So if you want to write down a question or a clarification, you might want to do that now and then we'll talk about that later. Okay. Okay, this is the question 4 word cloud. You'll remember this is the question asking folks to share if someone spoke to them about their gender identity journey, and then we asked the person who shared that story, how did they react to that? So it's pretty clear that the overwhelming response in these situations was the person who heard the story accepted the individual after they heard their journey in discovering their gender identity. You'll also see the other dark blue responses for this question. We had some individuals that did not have this experience. And then there are some other minor response tags for this question as well. Okay, so let's move on to the next one, and then these 2 will be, this one and the next slide will be displayed in one slide so we can talk about what summary statements we got from that information. This is the slide that shows you the word cloud for questions 5 and 6. And this relates to the mission statement itself, as well as different elements of Holmeswood life and how that applies to LGBTQ+ folks. And again, you'll see the top 5 responses in terms of prevalence, response tags, I should say, all are included and no restrictions. The all are included come from the fifth question that says, how does Holmeswood mission statement speak to inclusion of persons in the LGBT community in the life of our congregation? And the predominant response for that question was all are included. And secondary to that was all means all. And then the no restrictions response in this word cloud pertains to the question number 6, which says, are there any differences between LGBTQ plus individuals and how the privileges of membership at Holmeswood apply to them? Are there any differences between them and another person who's not LGBTQ plus? And the overwhelming response from that question was there are no restrictions for access for LGBTQ plus individuals to the different elements of membership activities, ordinances within Holmeswood. And I'll look at those with you in a second. Okay, so now I want to talk about what these last 3 questions mean, since they pertain to 2 different things. So on the left, I have question 4. On the right, I have questions 5 and 6. I thought this was really interesting because I think there's some congruity between the 2 in that the predominant view that individuals who shared their gender identity story with an individual at the meetings, that they accepted that person. And so I would expect to see in the last 2 questions an indication of that acceptance. And I think you see that in the responses we received, in that individuals indicated in a fairly predominant fashion that all are included in our mission statement. There is no group of individuals by any means, gender identity, race, ethnic persuasion, anything like that, that would exclude them from being fully included at Holmeswood. And then the other element of that I would expect to see in the last 2 questions is that because I'm LGBTQ plus as an individual who resides as a member at Holmeswood or comes to Holmeswood, that designation doesn't restrict my ability to participate in any number of things at Holmeswood. And the things that the Deacon Council considered were our 2 ordinances, which are baptism and the Lord's Supper, and then other privileges that members can experience at Holmeswood. And that would be things like someone being called to the ministry, someone being called to be a missionary, someone to be ordained to either one of those vocations or being ordained as a deacon. The responses also indicated that LGBTQ plus persons would be fully able to serve on a committee, any committee in the church where they could volunteer or be asked to serve. They could chair those committees. They would also be able to experience marriage as the couple would require, in terms of however we work with couples who decide to get married in the church. So the strong response we got back from the data that we looked at, the Deacon Council, was that there were no restrictions for individuals in the LGBT community from experiencing those items within our church, the ordinances or any privileges to participate in the life of the church. So these are the summary statements that we came up with out of the last 3 questions. Responses for the questions of how a person reacted when someone shared with them their story of being part of the LGBTQ plus community was one of fully accepting that person for what they are, and that was question 4. In looking at question 5 and 6, the responses for the question of the extent to which the mission statement affords LGBTQ plus members the privileges available to all members, we sensed in the responses that there was an emphatic stance in the responses related to how the mission statement speaks to inclusion of LGBTQ plus members. The common thing that we saw was all are included, all means all. The response indicated no restriction of privileges for the LGBTQ plus members in the community in terms of how the mission statement applies to them. And then looking at question 6, there were strong responses that individuals who identify within the LGBTQ plus community should be afforded the same access to the ordinances and different activities in the church afforded to members. Like I mentioned before, there were no restrictions based on their identity that would not exclude them from participating in any of those privileges or participating in our ordinances. And then I think the thing that kind of stuck out to me that was kind of interesting was during one of the fellowship sessions when the groups were sharing what they heard at their table, one of the things that came up, which was kind of interesting, was, I think it was John Brown who reported back from one of his table sessions. The comment came up, will you still love me? And I think that for me, that has stuck with me ever since we had the conversation in January, and I cannot get it out of my heart and out of my soul. And I think it speaks to who we are as individuals and followers of Christ. And as we are as a church, that we are to love people as they are. We certainly want to feel that love. And I think that statement has stuck with me as something that I still think about often during the day and in my prayer time of, will you still love me if you know something about me that I'm not comfortable telling, but if I tell it to you, will you still love me? I think that's an important part of that. So that ends the section of the process and the responses. And now I want to turn over to David so he can speak to some of the action items the Deacon Council came up with that we might want to consider. So David, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah. So from the very beginning, one of the things that was important for the Deacon Council was to try to do something that, especially in this time and this day, hasn't been done. In a time in which polarization is prevalent in all that we do. You're either on one side or the other. What the Deacon Council really also leaned in on was, well, how do we create a third option, a fourth option, so that we can more fully as a congregation listen to one another and talk to each other. So that is where this process came about. And early on for the council, it was very important that we said, we're not going to vote on this at this time, because this is a voting pits people against one another. There are winners and losers, and this is not about winning and losing. And so what the council came up with as some next steps is, this not necessarily an exhaustive list, but these are some of the next steps that the council is putting forth. Is the thesis of it is to lean even more fully into our mission statement. When the mission statement was created, it was intentionally created to be a mission, a vision of where we want to head as a congregation. And so as it relates to these conversations, the overwhelming majority of responses from folk were, how do we intentionally create Holmeswood to be a safe space for everyone? So the work that we do, the culture that we have is a safe space for the Kansas City community. And so one of those particular action items is to create a team, a subgroup for those people who want to become more engaged around LGBTQ issues and within Kansas City, as well as working to help create Holmeswood as a safer space for everyone, particularly LGBTQ community within Kansas City. And so this is a group that for those who want to become engaged, it is there. For those who do not want to become engaged, you don't have to. And for those who are, I'm not really sure what to do, well, you can participate for a while, or you can not for a while and then join. It is that fluid kind of space. So think of it similar to like the Social Justice Committee, but it would be a separate group, particularly focused on human sexuality and LGBTQ space within Kansas City and Holmeswood. One of the, and deeply connected to that, is one of the lessons that, one of the things that we heard in the council was we still have more education to do. So we spent a lot of time talking about theology and scripture and the Bible, but we also heard that it's going to be important that as we continue along this journey of a wider inclusion and wider embrace, that we need to hear more responses, more authoritative voices as it relates to medicine and psychology. And so to invite authoritative voices from, say, Children's Mercy or KU Med or Central Baptist Theological Seminary to come and educate us even more of human sexuality and gender identity. And the third line item or action item is focused on human sexuality and gender identity, but not limited to that. And that is to review our significant documents, our Constitution, our bylaws, policies, our employee handbook, to make sure that the language that is in those documents reflects a non-discriminatory language. So to make sure that if there's any discrimination towards race or towards sex or towards age or human sexuality and gender identity, to make sure that we're going to parse those out and clean those up. And so the board of directors will look at the Constitution, the bylaws, and the policies, and the personnel committee will look at the employee handbook and look at those documents to make sure that we are in accordance in those official documents. And so those are the again, non-exhaustive list, but this is our next steps as a community.
Thank you, David. Okay, so we want to give an opportunity for any questions anyone might have. So I'm trying to get back to, there we go. Everybody's back. So Tammy will kind of facilitate this. So if there are any questions anyone has, or Tammy, if you have any questions you want to ask.
No additional questions that I see in the chat that have not been answered. Correct me if someone sees something that I missed.
David, there was a question about providing the presentation electronically.
So the presentation is being recorded right now. And so we will upload that and then send that out as a link. And if you want the slides, the slides are available as well.
Yeah, we can provide slides. Yeah.
Yes.
Anyone have a question?
Anyone on the phone? I'll pick on them since they don't have access to the chat box. Anyone on the phone with a question?
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Two things. You're not thinking about changing our mission statement, are you? Because the word all means all to me.
No, that was not an action item out of this conversation, was to change that.
Okay. And the other word that really bothered me was the word privilege. I mean, you're saying it's a privilege to come to our church.
Well, I didn't, and that's my fault. I didn't intend that, Sue. I was trying to think of a word to talk to about the things that you're afforded as a member of Holmeswood. And that probably was a little too clinical, but it's the only word I could come up with. And I didn't think of it in those terms.
Okay.
Thank you for correcting me and keeping me on my toes.
There's a question in the chat. How will the new LGBTQ committee work now during COVID? What will be the process?
I suspect, and David can add to this, I suspect it'll do like anything else. Individuals who want to be part of that, I guess, David, if they want to notify you, and then we'll form up and, David we'll get a meeting together via Zoom or whatever and have meetings, on a regular basis.
Yeah, we'll publicize for those who want to become engaged. And then we will, to Tim's point, we'll meet via Zoom right now. And then when it's safer for us to come back together in physical space, we'll do that.
I've also received a question. Can someone elaborate on the homophobic responses that I see in the word clouds?
Yes. As I mentioned, we copied everything down that we heard. The recorders were very faithful to do that. In reading those responses, we found some misinformation individuals provided that are not, they're kind of outdated. They're just not accurate. And so we labeled those to kind of help us be able to pull those aside to help us identify what kind of education opportunities we needed to provide the congregation in general to make sure we're up to the latest information about how the LGBTQ community is viewed and what things really don't apply to them in terms of labels or expected behavior. So that's what that response, that represents. We tried to identify those things as what we consider a homophobic response, which is really what it is. But we wanted to, that's what that's for. What other questions do you have, anyone? Got plenty of time. Okay, David, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sorry, I just received a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Was there any indication in the responses that this could cause a divide or someone would leave over this?
Any kind of response like that in the responses, I was adding up the responses today. We have like 700 responses across 6 questions. There was not a strong sense in the responses people gave that would be something we'd see in terms of like a major split in the church or a major departure of people. That was just not something we saw in the responses.
Another question just popped up. What does this change for how we act, do, be at Holmeswood?
David, I'll let you field that one.
Say that this gives much more confidence to live more fully into who we already are. And what I mean by that is the mission statement has already been, I mean, that was unanimously embraced and voted upon at the 2017 business meeting. But there has been an elephant in the room as it relates to Holmeswood and human sexuality, gender identity, someone who is gay, lesbian, transgender. There has been an elephant in the room. And so what this does is this shows that at Holmeswood, this is not the main issue. I want to say that as clear as possible. This is not the main issue. But anytime that there's space in which someone is considered less than within the church, that's work that we as a community need to do. And so, and to till the ground. And so what this does is it shows that we as a church, we can sit around and talk with one another and listen to each other and see that there is a strong consensus, a strong voice in the group that says, if you are gay, if you're lesbian, if you're transgender, if you're bi, you are not less than at Holmeswood. And so to be able to embrace that more fully is where we are, more so as a congregation right now. And so in a practical sense, I mean, that's part of what this subgroup looks like. How do we get more engaged at home within Kansas City for those who want to? Well, I can't answer that question right now because we haven't formed, and we want to know, we want to become more aware of the LGBTQ community within Kansas City, not to come in to them and say, hey, you're good now. They've always been good. But as a way to say, how can we come and help connect and create space for those people who are deeply engaged, who are deeply desiring, wanting faith things with Christ, to make sure that Holmeswood is a safe place, a safe church for people like this, because not every church is like that.
I did receive another question. How does the Deacon Council feel about the overall process and results? Do they feel that we have made any steps forward?
I'll let the deacons on the phone answer that. I'm not going to answer for you.
I'll speak for myself. I think we've taken the elephant in the room and created a topic for discussion and a conversation that we want to move forward and be affirming, so that we're not dancing around something that nobody really wants to talk about. We've grappled with the topic.
Yeah, I would just say that I think the process was incredibly intentional. It was based in the Bible and what the Bible has to say, and good discussion with David facilitating on the verses that we all know in the Bible. I'll admit it was long, but I think it was a long process that was needed, because there was a lot to talk about. And I do believe that then the ensuing discussions that were had with the congregation and the variety of voices that were heard and given a chance to be heard, as well as the listening that occurred, all of it was incredibly healthy. I think, I don't want to speak on behalf of the rest of the deacons, but I do think that there is this sort of attitude of, now it's time to move on. You know, we're about being inclusive. We're about living the mission statement. Let's go truly live it.
Yeah, and Mike, I appreciate you saying that, and I agree. I think that it was a long process. We even kind of started talking about it, I think, certainly years ago. But I think that we are wanting to move forward. I think we've had good, healthy conversations, and it's been a good thing and a very good thing. And I really appreciate the openness that we've had amongst the deacons and others in talking about that, and certainly the leadership of David in getting us started and getting us going with this.
What other questions do we have? I just received one. Are we aware of any other churches in the community that have moved in this direction, and how they have gone about getting the message out to the community that they are all inclusive?
So I would say within Kansas City, a number of churches, I'm not aware of churches within the city right now that have recently gone through a process like this. I have talked with colleagues and pastors of churches around the country to learn some lessons. What did you do that worked? What did you do that didn't work? How did you all navigate this within your context? And so one of the things is that every church responded in a different kind of way. There is no cookie cutter kind of way to go through this. So similarly, how to get the word out is not necessarily a cookie cutter kind of space either. And so some already been leaning towards this way, and so it's a little bit more natural to more publicize it. Some churches sat with it for a while because that was just what was important for their context. For Holmeswood, we're not going to be a church, at least unless you all say so. We're not going to be a church that hangs a rainbow flag out in our front lawn, because again, this is not the main point. Christ is the main point. And so what makes sense for us to continue to get the word out is this Holmeswood is a safe place for everyone. And that no matter if you're gay or if you're Black or if you're white or if you're male or female or old or young, this is a place where we honor the Christ in each other and we fully worship the Christ as a collective community. So if I can bounce between those, I don't suspect we're going to be waving a rainbow flag in the front lawn. I also suspect we're not going to be sitting on this.
Another question. Sorry to interrupt you, David.
Sorry.
Another question came in. So are we officially open to same-sex weddings in the sanctuary, LGBT people serving as deacons, clergy, or is this left open-ended and unanswered?
The responses we received indicate that there are no restrictions. That's question 6, that to all the items you listed, we would not exclude an LGBTQ plus person from participating in any of those. Having said that, I don't recall there's a line of people waiting to get married in our church. Well, any at all, but I mean, that are same-sex or same-gender couples. That's not our current reality. And I'm not being flippant. I just think that there was no urgency to solve that problem. It's just the responses we got from the people who attended the meetings indicated there are no restrictions in the items you mentioned.
The next thing in my chat box is a comment rather than a question. It says the Deacon Council should be thanked and congratulated for conducting this process in the successful manner in which they have.
Okay. David, I'll turn it over to you to close this out.
How do you end a space like this? My first thought is amen, but that's not adequate. Holmeswood is such a uniquely sacred, holy space. Part of what I want to do is just sit with you for a moment.
All I got to say is, David, I'm glad this subject came up because I have been wondering about this since this coronavirus stuff started. And since we've been doing church virtual, I've been wondering what's been going on about it. So I'm glad the subject came up.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you, Christine.
Uh-huh.
What if we do this? I love you. And I mean that from the bottom gumption of my being. The Deacon Council has worked hard for the past 2 years. This congregation has worked hard since 1955. In a space and a time, especially right now, when division is the air that we breathe, and polarization is what flows through our space. Holmeswood is doing another thing, doing the realm of God, kingdom of God thing. So know that I'm grateful for you. Know that you are loved. And Holmeswood is a space that takes serious the love of Christ and is now more equipped to go express that intentional love even more fully to Kansas City. I'll close this in prayer. Creator God, we give thanks that you are the one who fully embraces and fully loves. Lord, I give thanks for the good folk of Holmeswood Baptist Church, those who have come before, those who are here now, and those who are yet to come. Lord, I give thanks that this is a faith community that takes you seriously and takes your command and your guidance to love everyone. Lord, we sit in your presence and we look to see that your presence is in everyone who is around us. May you know that we deeply love you. And may you know that we take serious the call that you have called us to be of your people at 97th and Holmes. We give thanks for your Son, for both his crucifixion and his resurrection. And may his way be our way, which is your way. And all of this we pray. Amen. Go in peace.
Good night to you all.
Good night, Christine. It's great
Good night.
seeing you.
Okay, you too, David.
Yes, ma'am.
Tell your wife and your family that me and my girls said hi.
I will absolutely do that and give your girls a big old hug from me as well.
Okay, I will.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye, Christine.
I'm hanging on just to see
That's it. Yeah.
comments
Yeah.
there.